On a Tuesday morning in late January, the temperature in Minneapolis dropped to 22 degrees below 0 Celsius. Local radio warned people not to stay outdoors for more than 10 minutes. Steam rising from the heating vents on the rooftops froze into white columns standing motionless against the sky, as if the city itself were holding its breath. On Nicollet Avenue, in the heart of the city's financial district, the North Star Trust Bank Tower rose 42 stories of glass. People came and went through its brass revolving doors, everyone walking fast, necks tucked into wool scarves, nobody looking at anybody. In cold like this, stopping means pain. At exactly 9:15, that revolving door pushed a child inside. She was about 9 years old, wearing a grey coat faded to the color of ash, zipped up to her chin. Except the zipper was broken in the middle, leaving a small gap where the wind had been slipping through for 2 days straight. Her left sneaker gaped open at the toe, wrapped shut with silver duct tape, the kind people use to patch water pipes. Her hands were raw red, and when the warmth of the bank lobby hit her face, she swayed for a moment, as if even warmth could knock a person down. Her name was Isla Fennick, and in the inside pocket of her coat, pressed against her chest, she carried an old bank card wrapped in a plastic bread bag, folded in 4, held closed with a rubber band. The granite floor of North Star Trust was polished so bright that Isla could see herself upside down beneath her feet, a small grey smudge among the black smudges of overcoats and the brown smudges of expensive leather shoes. The lobby ceiling soared like a cathedral's. At the reception desk, a carefully made-up woman looked up, and her eyes did the thing Isla had grown used to over the past 8 months. They slid across the girl, stopped, and hardened. Isla had not come to beg. She had not come to warm herself, even though it was cold enough outside to kill. She stood as straight as her trembling knees would allow, stepped up to the desk, and said the sentence she had rehearsed all night at the bus shelter on Hennepin Avenue, rehearsed until her lips cracked and bled. "I'd like to check my balance, please." The receptionist blinked. Somewhere behind, a short laugh rose and cut itself off. And in the corner of the lobby, next to the door leading to the teller floor, a large security guard in a navy uniform slowly set down his coffee cup, because he knew that, according to procedure, what came next was his job. His job was to escort the child outside. Outside, where 22 below was waiting. To understand why a 9-year-old girl was standing in the lobby of the biggest bank in Minneapolis on the coldest morning of the year, you have to go back 2 days to a place 4 kilometers to the northeast, the Pierre Bottineau branch of the public library in the city's northeast neighborhood. For the past 8 months, the library had been where Isla lived by day. She knew exactly which chair in the children's section sat outside the librarian's line of sight. She knew the water fountain on the 2nd floor ran stronger than the one on the 1st, strong enough to wash her face. She knew that the white-haired librarian named Doris tended to forget a bag of cookies on the reading table by the window on Friday afternoons, and that both of them pretended not to know who that bag was for. But the library closed at 8 in the evening, and a Minnesota winter does not care about closing hours. On the first of those last 2 nights, Isla slept at the covered bus shelter on Hennepin Avenue, where heat from the laundromat next door leaked through the brick wall, enough to keep her from freezing to death, not enough to make her stop shaking. She lay on her side, curled around her backpack, and did what she did every night. She slid her hand into her inside pocket, felt through the layer of plastic, and counted the 4 corners of the card. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still there. Only then would she let herself close her eyes. I want to pause on that plastic bag. A bank card is made of plastic. It doesn't fear water, doesn't fear dirt, doesn't need anyone's protection. And yet, Isla kept it wrapped in a bread bag, folded in four, bound with a rubber band, the way people wrap the last photograph of someone who has died. Because to this child, the thing inside that plastic wasn't a card. It was her mother's voice, shrunk down into an object small enough to hold. You don't wrap something in plastic to keep out the water. You wrap it to keep from losing the last thing you have. Printed on the card was a name, Corinne Fenwick, Isla's mother. She had died 11 months earlier. The second night was worse. The laundromat closed early because of the snowstorm, and the brick wall cooled slowly, like a body going still. Around 3 in the morning, Isla woke because she could no longer feel 2 of the toes on her left foot, the foot in the gaping shoe. She sat up, took the shoe off, pressed her foot against her stomach under her layers of clothing, and while she sat like that, dry-eyed, watching the snow slant through the streetlight, the girl arrived at a decision. Not a decision made of courage. 9-year-olds don't decide with courage. She decided with the simplest arithmetic in the world. 1 more night like this one, and I will die. Mom said keep the card. Mom said, when you truly need it. If now is not truly need, then nothing ever will be. The next morning she asked Doris at the library, in a voice straining to sound merely curious, which bank was the biggest in the city. Doris said North Star Trust, the main branch on Nicollet, and then looked at the girl a beat longer than usual. Isla said thank you and left before that look could turn into a question. She walked 4 kilometers in 20 below cold, stopping 3 times inside convenience stores so her hands wouldn't seize up. And each time she stepped back out, she rehearsed the sentence again. I'd like to check my balance, please. Not asking for charity, not telling her story, just a question any customer had the right to ask. In the past 8 months, the thing this child had lost most wasn't a home. It was the right to ask ordinary questions without being looked at like a problem that needed solving. But the story of that card begins before the 2 days of wandering, before the 8 months without a roof. It begins in a basement kitchen at St. Bridget's Church in northeast Minneapolis, where the smell of white bean soup with smoked ham hocks had soaked into the walls for so long that people joked, tear the church down and the smell of soup would still be standing there on its own. Corinne Fenwick worked in that charity kitchen 6 days a week, starting the year Isla turned 3. The church could only afford to pay her for half of it. She covered the other half, cleaning offices on the night shift. Corinne was not the kind of woman newspapers write about. She never raised $1 million, never pulled anyone from a fire. What she did was much smaller and much harder. She remembered everyone's name. At a soup kitchen, people come and go like shadows. But Corinne stood behind the pot and called each shadow by its name. Morning, Mr. Walzak. How's that knee today? Hey, Denny, you said you had an interview last week. How'd it go? There were grown men who had sat crying over a bowl of soup, not because of the soup, but because it had been 3 years since anyone had said their name correctly. Among the people who came to eat, there was an old man everyone called the Railroad Man. He first appeared one November afternoon, tall, thin, stooped, wearing a workman's canvas jacket, worn but strangely clean, every button fastened. He sat at the far corner table, ate slowly, folded his paper napkin in 4 after using it, and washed his own tray even though no rule required it. He spoke to no one. People assumed he was one of the city's hundreds of solitary old men, living on a pension, coming in for one hot meal. Only Corinne noticed one small thing. His shoes. Old leather shoes, but carefully polished, laces evenly tied. The truly destitute no longer have the strength to polish their shoes. A man who polishes his shoes to eat at a soup kitchen is a man who has come for a different kind of hunger. She didn't ask. She simply began saving that corner table for him, and one day she set down 2 slices of bread in front of him instead of 1 and said,
"The kitchen has extra bread today. Help me make sure it doesn't go to waste."
The bread was not extra, but some lies are the highest form of courtesy. The old man's name was Gideon Pierce. It took nearly 2 months and countless bowls of soup before that name was spoken. Then, piece by piece, slow as the dismantling of an old machine, his story emerged. 41 years as an engineer for the railroad, running ore and grain lines across the upper Midwest. A wife named Marta, lost to cancer 12 years earlier. No children, no living siblings. A small wooden house in Marshall Terrace near the Mississippi, where he lived alone with the clocks he repaired, and a silence that thickened year by year. "I'm not short on food, Ms. Fenwick," he confessed one day, eyes down on his soup. "I'm short on this." He swept his hand in a small circle, meaning the clink of spoons on bowls, the scrape of chairs, the sound of Corinne calling somebody's name from the head of the kitchen. At my house, even the refrigerator running sounds loud. And Isla turned 6, then 7, then 8 in that kitchen, doing her homework at a corner table while her mother stirred the pot. She was the only child there, which made her everyone's child. But she attached herself to Mr. Pierce most of all, because Mr. Pierce knew things no one else knew. Why train horns in America blow long, long, short, long before every crossing. Why the rails sing a different note in winter than in summer. And how to listen to the track and know how far away the train still is. The Christmas Isla turned 8, Mr. Pierce handed her a small package wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a wooden whistle he had carved himself, shaped like a steam locomotive, sanded so smooth it felt like holding a warm river stone. "Try it," he said. Isla blew. The sound came out low and mournful, like a freight train at midnight. "In the old days," Mr. Pierce said, "when a train broke down in the middle of nowhere, the crew blew the whistle so the rescue team could find them. Remember that. If you're ever lost, don't go quiet. Keep making a sound, and someone will find you." That whistle, 11 months later, was riding in the backpack of a child sleeping at a bus shelter on Hennepin Avenue. Isla had never once blown it out on the street, but every night she held it in her hand until she fell asleep. Last fall, Mr. Pierce fell ill. Heart failure, the stage where doctors use gentle words to say something that is not gentle. He refused the nursing home. "I was born in a house, and I will die in a house." And since he had no one, Corinne became the person nobody appointed, but who showed up anyway. After her kitchen shift, she rode 2 buses to Marshall Terrace, cooked him chicken porridge, sorted his pills into morning, noon, night compartments, and read him the sports page because his eyes could no longer manage small print. Isla sat on the floor beside his bed, winding his clocks. And that little house, in the last 3 months of an old man's life, was full of ticking and full of voices, the 2 sounds he had gone without for 12 years. One evening, Corinne overheard him on the telephone with someone, his voice unusually crisp, repeating a phrase that sounded like, "The office of Hollis and Grange," and "Do it properly, leave no loopholes." She assumed he was arranging his funeral. She didn't ask. You don't ask a dying man about his phone calls. Gideon Pierce passed away on a February morning in his sleep, while snow fell thick outside, and the clocks in his house kept perfect time. 9 people attended the funeral, counting the priest. Isla placed a drawing in the casket, a train crossing a field, its smoke curling into the shape of a heart. Nobody paid attention to a man in a grey overcoat standing at the back of the chapel, who signed the condolence book with a name no one bothered to read, and left before the service ended. 3 weeks after Mr. Pierce's funeral, a letter was mailed to Corinne Fenwick. It never reached her, because at that very time, a different letter had arrived first. A letter taped to the door of every unit in the Halverson apartment building on Marshall Street, where mother and daughter had rented a 1-bedroom for 6 years. Notice of lease termination. This property has been acquired by Ashcroft Properties. All residents must vacate within 60 days. The Halverson was the kind of building that real estate people describe with a chilling little phrase: "The value is in the land." Ashcroft Properties had bought the entire Riverside block to build luxury condominiums overlooking the Mississippi. On the full-color master plan hanging in the company lobby, the Halverson was just a gray box with a code number. Nobody at the company knew that inside that gray box lived a woman who worked at a soup kitchen and a 9-year-old girl who collected the sounds of train whistles. Corinne filed a request for an extension. She needed more time. She hadn't yet saved enough for a deposit on a new place. The request was answered with a form letter, signature pre-printed. The person whose name appeared on those form letters, under the company's chain of authorization, was the chief executive. His name was Roland Ashcroft. Mother and daughter moved out of the Halverson in April into a week-to-week rooming house in near North, damp and cold. In May, Corinne started coughing. She didn't see a doctor. Every clinic visit cost a day's wages, and rent, charged by the week, waits for no one. By the time she collapsed at the St. Bridget kitchen and was taken to the hospital, both lungs were so badly infected that the doctor looked at the X-ray, then looked at the floor, and did not look anyone in the eye. She was hospitalized for 9 days. On the 8th night, when Isla was allowed in to sit by the bed, Corinne was already very weak. She told the girl to open the drawer of the bedside table and take out the cloth wallet. Inside the wallet was the old ivory-white bank card. "I opened this account when you were born. There isn't much in it. I put in what I could, whenever I could. But it's in my name, and Isla, listen to me. Keep it. Don't give it to anyone. When you truly need it, do you understand me? Truly need it. You go to the bank and you ask them to check. Promise me." Isla promised. Children make promises they don't yet understand and keep them more tightly than adults keep the promises they understand all too well. Corinne Fenwick died at dawn the next morning, 37 years old. On the hospital intake form, under next of kin, there was exactly one name, and that name was 9 years old. Child Services placed Isla with the temporary foster family all the way out in St. Cloud, 100 kilometers from Minneapolis. She stayed 19 days. On the 20th, she packed the wooden whistle, the card, and a photograph of her mother into her backpack and took a bus back to the city. Back to the only place on earth where the smell of white bean soup lived in the walls. She never returned to St. Cloud. The system logged her as runaway from placement, one status line in a database, and that status line slowly sank beneath the newer lines, the way everything sinks when it belongs to someone with no one left to shout their name. 8 months. Summer sleeping in parks, autumn sleeping on the church porch, winter sleeping in bus shelters. The St. Bridget kitchen changed managers, the familiar faces scattered, and through all 8 of those months,
A letter from the law office of Hollis and Grange sat in the dead mail bin of the demolished Halverson building. Returned to sender. Waiting inside a records box with a label pasted on the outside, addressee not found. I want to pause on that returned letter. We like to imagine fate as something enormous, thunderbolts, destiny. But most of the time, fate operates through far more ordinary machinery. An old address, a return to sender stamp, a records box nobody opens. The one thing that could have saved Isla Fenwick through those 8 months existed the entire time, lying quietly in the dark of an archive, exactly 6 kilometers from the bus shelter where the child lay curled against the cold. The world is not cruel the way movies tell it. The world is cruel the way a letter is cruel when it cannot find its addressee.
Back to the lobby of North Star Trust, 9:15, Tuesday morning. The security guard who set down his coffee was named Marcus Bell, 46 years old, 11 years at this branch. Marcus stood 6'3", shoulders wide as a door, and he had a flaw his wife Ruth teased him about as the job picking the wrong man. He was no good at making anyone leave. 3 months earlier, Marcus had received a formal written warning. The offense? Allowing a homeless man to warm himself in the ATM vestibule for 40 minutes during a blizzard. The branch manager, Douglas Ray, had called him into the office, laid the warning on the desk, and said, in the voice of a man convinced he is being reasonable, "Marcus, I get it, but this is a bank, not a shelter. One more incident and I'll have to escalate it to regional. You're 4 years from your 20, full pension. Don't be foolish." 4 years, full pension. Ruth was diabetic. Her medication ate a quarter of his paycheck every month. Their oldest boy was about to start college. Marcus Bell did not have the luxury of uncalculated kindness. He was a man who had to budget every act of it. So when he saw the child in the grey coat standing at reception, Marcus followed procedure. He walked over slowly, hands hanging loose at his sides to look less threatening. The receptionist gave him the relieved glance of someone who has just handed off a problem. Marcus crouched down to the girl's eye level. And that was when he saw 3 things in exactly this order. 3 things that 11 years on a lobby floor had taught him to read. First, the shoe wrapped in duct tape. Second, the rims of her ears, bruised red. The mark of someone who has been walking a long time in hard cold, not sitting on a sidewalk asking for change. And third, the girl wasn't looking at the teller drawers. She wasn't looking at the customers' handbags. She was looking up at the sign overhead, the one that read, "Customer Service." And her lips were moving, reading it back to herself, as if to confirm she had come to the right place. "Hey there," Marcus said. "What can I do for you?" Illa turned. Almost by reflex, she took half a step back. 8 months on the street had taught her that a uniform means being told to leave. But she said her rehearsed line anyway. "I'd like to check my balance, please. I have a card." Then, like an attorney presenting evidence, she drew the little plastic bundle from her inside pocket, worked the rubber band off with fingers still stiff from the cold, unfolded each crease, and held out the worn, ivory-white card. Marcus looked at the card, looked at the plastic bag, folded flat with the care of a ritual. And for about 2 seconds, inside that man's head, a trial took place that no one could see. On one side, the written warning, Mr. Ray, 4 years, the pension, Ruth's medication. On the other, a child who wrapped her bank card in a bread bag. Procedure said, an unaccompanied minor is not a customer. Escort her out. Call the police non-emergency line if necessary. Procedure was written by people sitting in warm rooms. "All right," Marcus said, "but this desk is just reception. Come with me. We'll go to the teller floor. That's where they can run a card." He said it a little louder than necessary, loud enough for the receptionist to hear, loud enough for the cameras to record that the security guard was escorting a customer, not harboring a stray child. 11 years in the job teach a man not only how to read people, but how to read cameras. He led the girl across the main lobby, and that 30-meter walk took Illa Phoenix straight past the signing table set up in the VIP banking area, where, that very morning, North Star Trust was hosting its biggest client of the quarter, Roland Ashcroft. Roland Ashcroft was 58 that year, and if you ask the people who had worked with him to describe him in one word, they would choose precise. The charcoal bespoke suit, precise. The 3-second handshake, precise. The $1.7 billion fortune built over 30 years out of land along abandoned railroad corridors, precise to the square meter. But there was one thing about Roland Ashcroft that the business press had written about until it went stale, and that he himself had told until it became recitation. He was born poor. Genuinely poor, not memoir poor. His father worked the stockyards in South St. Paul, lost the job when Roland was 12, and then lost the rest of his life to drink. Roland grew up in a house where every knock on the door might be a creditor, and that boy swore himself an oath that went on to shape the whole of the man. "I will never again stand on the side of the door being knocked on." He kept the oath. 16-hour days for 3 decades. No drinking, no gambling, no scandals. And from his own life, Roland Ashcroft derived a theorem he believed with all the sincerity of a man who had once been hungry. I got out. Therefore, anyone can get out. Whoever doesn't get out simply hasn't tried hard enough. That is not cruelty. It is something more dangerous than cruelty. A false conclusion drawn from a true experience. You can argue with a cruel man. It is very hard to argue with a man who believes his scars are evidence. That morning, Ashcroft Properties was signing a $200 million credit facility with North Star Trust to break ground on Phase 2 of the River Landing project, a string of luxury condominiums along the Mississippi. Phase 1 of that same project had been completed the previous year, built on the footprint of the old apartment blocks cleared along Marshall Street. Among them, the Halverson. Branch manager Douglas Ray stood beside the signing table, wearing the smile of a man serving 1% of his annual revenue. The communications team's camera flashed, and in the middle of that scene, Roland Ashcroft looked up from the file and saw the big security guard leading a ragged child past the VIP area. "Douglas," he said, not loudly, but the whole table heard it. "Is your branch running a charity ward now?" A few soft laughs around the table, the laughter of people laughing not because something is funny, but because the man who made the joke controls 200 million of their dollars. Mr. Ray went pale, turned, and beckoned Marcus over, his voice hissing through his teeth. "Belle, we have had this conversation. Get her out of here. Now." Marcus stood up straight. He could feel every pair of eyes in the lobby turning toward him. And what he felt most clearly of all was the small hand gripping the hem of his uniform jacket. Gripping very lightly. The grip of a child who has learned that if you hold on too hard, people pry you off. "Mr. Ray," Marcus said, clearly neither loud nor quiet. "This young lady is a customer. She holds a card issued by this bank and has requested a balance inquiry. Under policy, every legitimate cardholder is entitled to service. Cardholder. Ray looked the child up and down, stopping at the duct-taped shoe. Do you hear yourself? And then Roland Ashcroft did something that silenced the entire signing table. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, walked around the table, and headed toward the child. Not out of compassion. Roland Ashcroft was in the mood of a man who has just closed a major deal, the generous mood of a winner, the kind of generosity that likes an audience. "Allow me," he said to Ray. "I want to see this." "Young lady, you'd like to check your balance?" "Fine. I will personally look it up with you. This bank is very fond of me. They'll lend me any machine I like. Isn't that right, Douglas?" It was a performance. Everyone in that lobby understood it was a performance. The magnate, flush with victory, indulging a little street girl in front of a crowd. In 10 minutes, it would become a dinner party anecdote. "So I run the card for the kid, and gentlemen, guess the balance. $3.80, if that." The laughter had already been paid out in advance in the eyes of his aides. Ela did not grasp those layers. She grasped one thing only. The silver-haired man in the suit was carrying her mother's card toward the computer at the VIP counter, and that meant the answer was coming. She followed, and Marcus stayed close behind her, because he had already made his decision. If today cost him the job, so be it. He was not going to let this child stand alone in the middle of these people. Mr. Ray logged into the terminal himself, a management-grade workstation with access to archived accounts long dormant. Roland Ashcroft handed him the card between two fingers, the way one holds something slightly unclean, and turned to wink at the signing table. The ivory-white card slid into the reader. "Now then," Roland said, "let's see what's in our treasure chest." The screen loaded. 1 second, 2. The system gave a soft chime, the alert tone for an account carrying a special flag. Mr. Ray frowned, typed another command, and the screen refreshed. And then, 2 lines appeared on the monitor. The first line was the balance of the checking account in the name of Corinne Fenwick, $214.61. Everything a soup kitchen mother had managed to set aside in 9 years, deposited $10 at a time, $20 at a time. But beneath it stood a second line, in bold, tagged with a legal alert code. Linked account. Marta P. Trust. Beneficiary, Ela Marie Fenwick. Trustee of record, Hollis and Grange, LLP. Net asset value as of last reporting period, $11,348,906.22. $11,348,906.22. The laughter paid out in advance in the aide's eyes was never redeemed. The VIP floor of North Star Trust fell into a kind of silence that Marcus Bell, in 11 years on that lobby floor, had never once heard. The silence of many adults, simultaneously swallowing a laugh. Roland Ashcroft was the best reader of numbers within a mile of that monitor. He needed no one to explain what 11 million meant. But for the first 30 seconds, the thing that held his eyes was not the number. It was the name of the trust. Marta P. Then Mr. Ray, his hands already trembling, opened the attached archival file. The trust's founding declaration, scanned from the original. Grantor, Gideon A. Pierce, Date established, December, 2 years prior. And in the field for the beneficiary's mailing address, a line the system had struck through with the annotation, "Mail returned, addressee not found." Unit 3B, Halverson Apartments, 2214 Marshall Street, Minneapolis. Roland Ashcroft knew the name Gideon Pierce, and he knew the address, 2214 Marshall Street. 30 years earlier, when Roland was a 28-year-old broker knocking on doors along the abandoned rail corridors to assemble land, he had sat at the kitchen table of a railroad engineer named Gideon Pierce, drinking weak coffee, and bought from him 3 parcels along the right-of-way at a fair price. A rare, gentle transaction for those days. Pierce hadn't haggled hard. He had only asked, again and again, one question that young Roland remembered forever because it struck him as absurd. Build whatever you want on it, but don't put anyone out in winter. Putting people out in winter is a sin. That parcel later became the foundation of the first building to bear the Ashcroft name. In a very literal, ledger book sense, this entire empire had broken ground on that old man's land. As for 2214 Marshall Street, Roland needed no lookup. The Halverson block, the gray box coded H7 on the River Landing Phase 1 master plan. 42 households, cleared within 60 days, on schedule, within the law, per procedure. He even remembered complimenting the legal department on how cleanly it was done. Cleared in February and March, in the middle of a Minnesota winter. On the screen in front of him now, a chain of cause and effect was laid out as neatly as a bank statement. The old man who sold me my first land told me never to put anyone out in winter. That old man left his entire fortune to a child. The child's address was the building I cleared. In winter. And therefore, the letter carrying news of the fortune never found its addressee. And therefore, the child who had inherited $11 million slept on the street for 8 months. And this morning she stands here, shoe held together with duct tape, while I sign $200 million to keep building on that very ground. And I was just about to make her the punchline. People like to imagine the powerful man's moment of reckoning as a scene of collapse, falling to his knees, face in his hands. Nothing of the kind happened at the VIP counter of North Star Trust that morning. Roland Ashcroft simply stood very still. Only his right hand, the hand still holding the little folded plastic bag the girl had handed over with the card, slowly closed into a fist. I want to pause on that hand. Roland Ashcroft had held thousands of contracts in his time, sheets of paper worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but perhaps no sheet of paper had ever weighed as much as this plastic bread bag. The packaging a child had used to protect her mother's relic through 8 months without a roof. Months that included a winter created by his own authorized signature. The number on the screen did not accuse him. Numbers acquit everyone. A number is only a number. The plastic bag was the indictment. "Mr. Ashcroft," Ray said quietly, The procedure for a trust account of this kind is to notify the trustee's office, and since the beneficiary is an unaccompanied minor, we're also required to notify child services. I'm afraid—" "Call Hollis and Grange first," Roland said. His voice had dropped, and those who knew him understood that this was his real voice, the one he used when there was no audience left. "Tell them to send someone down this morning. And Douglas, the child hasn't had breakfast. Your bank has a client lounge. Use it." Through all those minutes, Isla Fenwick stood beside Marcus, understanding none of what was happening. She saw grown-ups go pale, saw the branch manager stammering into a phone, saw the silver-haired man fall suddenly silent. She tugged at Marcus's sleeve and asked the only question that this entire event for her came down to. "Sir, is there money in my mum's card?" Marcus Bell looked down at the girl. He had seen the number on the screen. He had also seen the line above it, $214.61. And with a father's instinct, he understood which of those two lines was the answer this child was actually asking about. He went down on one knee to her eye level. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "Your mom saved it for you. For 9 years, every month, your mom put something away." Isla nodded. And then the child who had not cried through 2 days of walking in killing cold, who had not cried while being looked up and down in the middle of a granite lobby, burst into tears over $214.61. At noon that day, Ms. Evelyn Grange, senior attorney at Hollis & Grange and trustee of record for the Marta P. Trust, arrived at the bank carrying a leather briefcase. And 14 months of professional anguish. Hers was the office where the returned letter had sat waiting. They had hired a skip tracing service. They had filed inquiries with child services, where Isla's file ended at the status line. Runaway from placement, whereabouts unknown. A child with no phone, no address, and no school enrollment is a child invisible to every system ever designed by adults. In the bank's client lounge, before Isla, Marcus, and a child services caseworker who had just been summoned, Ms. Grange told the part of the story that no living person knew in full, except the papers she had brought with her. In December, 2 years earlier, 3 months after his heart failure diagnosis, and 2 months after Corinne Fenwick began coming to care for him, Gideon Pierce walked into the offices of Hollis & Grange wearing the only suit he owned, the kind of suit a man keeps for funerals. He carried a stack of documents that left the attorneys stunned, the accumulated stock ledger of a frugal, solitary railroad man across 40 years. Railroad shares bought steadily every quarter since the 70s, dividends reinvested, not one share ever sold. Plus the proceeds from 3 parcels of trackside land sold to a young broker 30 years before. Money he had quietly put into stock as well, so I wouldn't have to think about it. The old clock mender who ate at a charity kitchen had never been poor. He simply had no one to spend money with. "He sat right where you're sitting," Ms. Grange said, "and he told me this. All my life, I drove trains full of freight and fortune straight through poor towns, and not one car ever stopped. Now, I want one car to stop." The trust was named for his late wife, Marta, sole beneficiary, Isla Marie Fenwick. Mr. Pierce had considered leaving it to Corinne and had crossed her name out himself, replacing it with her daughter's. Ms. Grange still kept the draft bearing that strike-through. In the margin, in an engineer's upright hand, he had written one line of explanation. "She will refuse it. People like her always refuse. But no one can refuse on behalf of their child." The trust's terms were as airtight as you would expect from a man who spent his life working to a train schedule. Principal locked until Isla's 25th birthday, managed by an independent trustee. Until then, the trust would disperse only for the child's direct needs, housing, education, medical care, paid straight to the providers, never passing through the hands of any guardian. In his final phone call with the law office 3 weeks before he died, he gave only one instruction: the same sentence Corinne had once overheard through the door. Do it properly. Leave no loopholes. The old man left no loopholes in the paperwork. The only loophole lay outside the paperwork. One notification letter, one demolished address, and 8 months in which a child fell straight through every net that society believed it had strung.
Isla sat and listened to all of it, both hands on the table, next to the wooden locomotive whistle she had taken out of her backpack without anyone noticing. When Miss Grange finished, the girl was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked a question that appeared in no adult script in that room. So, did Mr. Pierce know that my mom died too? Miss Grange looked down at her file. No, he didn't. He had died a month before Corinne. No, sweetheart. He went first. Good, Isla said. He liked my mom a lot. It would have made him sad. There were 4 adults in that room who were paid to maintain professional composure. After the child said that, none of the 4 looked at one another for several seconds.
News like this does not stay contained. By the end of the week, the story of the homeless girl who inherited over $11 million in the lobby of a Minneapolis bank had climbed from the local news to the national aggregators. People called it a winter fairy tale. And like every treasure freshly discovered, it immediately attracted relatives. The man's name was Vance Fenwick, 44, of Fargo, North Dakota, older brother of the father who had walked out on Corinne before Isla turned 1 and who had died in a workplace accident in Texas years ago. Vance was Isla's uncle by blood. That much was true on paper. Also true on paper, in the 9 years of Isla's life, not one phone call, not one card, not $1 had ever traveled from Fargo south. When Corinne lay in the hospital for 9 days, the hospital had tracked down Vance's number and called. That call lasted 40 seconds and ended with the sentence, "That woman's family is no concern of mine." $11 million is the one known cure for no concern of mine. Vance appeared in Minneapolis with a young lawyer and a petition for guardianship and gave interviews on the steps of the Hennepin County Family Court in a voice choked to precisely the correct dosage. That little girl is the only blood my brother left in this world. Her place is with family. He pronounced the word family very roundly. The cameras loved that word. The guardianship hearing took place 2 weeks later. Appearing on Isla's side, besides Ms. Grange in her capacity as trustee, was a married couple who had filed for temporary foster placement and passed the county's screening, Marcus and Ruth Bell. They had filed 3 days after that morning at the bank, before the story ever reached the press. A detail the Child Services file recorded with a timestamp that could not be argued with. Ruth had told the caseworker one sentence that would later be repeated in the courtroom. "We didn't know the child had $11 million. My husband just came home and told me there was a little girl who kept her mother's bank card wrapped in a plastic bread bag, and he didn't sleep that whole night." Everyone expected a long, legal battle. It was over in 20 minutes. Because Ms. Evelyn Grange, with the calm of a woman who had left no loopholes, presented to the court the architecture of the Marta P. Trust, principal untouchable until the beneficiary turned 25. Every disbursement paid directly to service providers. The guardian, whoever it might be, unable to touch a single cent. No guardianship stipend drawn from the trust, no financial power of attorney. Nothing. Gideon Pierce, a man who had spent his life calculating train schedules, had calculated for passengers like Vance Fenwick before they ever bought a ticket. The judge asked Vance whether he wished to continue presenting his petition to raise his only remaining blood, under the conditions just described. Vance's lawyer requested a recess to confer. The conference lasted exactly 1 lunch hour. Early that afternoon, the guardianship petition was withdrawn for personal reasons. Vance Fenwick drove back to Fargo without meeting Isla even once, including this time. Perhaps that was the single kindness he ever did the girl, confirming by his own actions that she had not lost one more relative, because that relative had never existed. I want to pause on the 2 petitions in that courtroom, Vance's and the Bell's, because side by side they form a perfect experiment. The same child, the same week. 2 men filling out the same form from the Hennepin County Family Court. One filled it out after reading the number in the news. One filled it out after seeing the plastic bag. The forms were identical, and no field on them asked, "Why do you want this child?" But the timestamps did. In the end, what separates kindness from greed is sometimes a single question. Did you arrive before or after you learned the number? The court granted temporary custody to the Bells, with a pathway to formal adoption under review. On her first night in their small house in the Longfellow neighborhood, Ruth made up the bedroom of their oldest son, who had left for the dorms. She asked the girl if she needed anything else. Isla said the room was really nice, then hesitated and asked for one thing, a new plastic bag, because the old one's starting to tear. Ruth brought up a small wooden box with a lock, a jewelry box. How about this instead? Isla shook her head, hugging the old plastic bundle to her chest. My mom wrapped it in a bread bag, she said, as if that were the entire explanation. And it was the entire explanation. Ruth Bell understood at once. Some things are kept not because they last, but because of whose hands did the folding. She went down to the kitchen, took out a fresh plastic bread bag, and the 2 of them, a 50-year-old woman and a 9-year-old child, sat and refolded the card along the same 4 old creases. And Roland Ashcroft? The press waited for him to do what billionaires do in stories like this. Launch a scholarship fund in his own name, pose for photographs with the child, recount his moment of awakening in an exclusive interview. The Ashcroft Properties communications team had drafted 3 such scenarios. He killed all 3. What Roland Ashcroft did after that morning came with no press releases. People could only piece it together from fragments. Fragment 1. Phase 2 of the river landing project was pushed back 4 months, and when the revised plans were refiled with the city planning department, the new towers contained 80 units designated affordable housing. The very thing that Roland himself, at a real estate conference 2 years earlier, had called a tax on ambition. Shareholders demanded answers. His reply, in the minutes of the meeting, was exactly 1 sentence.
Charge it to me.
Fragment 2. The church kitchen at St. Bridget, which had scraped for funding season after season, suddenly received an anonymous grant committed for 10 years, with one strange condition written into the paperwork. The kitchen must always keep one corner table where children can sit and do their homework. The priest guessed and guessed. He never guessed right. And fragment 3, the smallest, came from a night watchman at the river landing construction site. One evening in March, he saw the chairman's car parked at the edge of the Phase 1 grounds, where the Halverson apartments once stood. Roland Ashcroft stepped out and stood alone for a long time in front of the new buildings, the windows of the luxury units glowing gold above him. The watchman approached and asked if he needed anything. The man didn't turn his head. He only asked one question, which the watchman remembered forever because he had no idea how to answer it. Do you happen to know where Unit 3B used to be? No one knows whether Roland Ashcroft was ever forgiven, because he never asked to be. He never went to see Isla. Ms. Grange confirmed there had been an offer of free legal support from Ashcroft's attorneys during the guardianship case, and confirmed it was politely declined because the trust didn't need it. Perhaps he understood something that many powerful men never do. There are debts for which loud repayment is only another form of borrowing. His debt was not owed to the child. It was owed to the 42 households of a grey box coded H7. People with no trust fund waiting for them, who had scattered across the city and never made the news. 80 affordable units cannot give anyone back that winter. But they were the only thing a man like him knew how to say, in place of an apology. He said it in square meters. June. Minneapolis turned to summer. The Mississippi ran green again, and in the basement of St. Bridget's Church, the smell of white bean soup with smoked ham hocks still stood in its old place in the walls, as if no winter had ever passed through. Saturday afternoon, the kitchen was crowded. Behind the counter, next to the big soup pot, stood a 10-year-old girl on a wooden step stool set out just for her, ladle in hand, filling each bowl full. She had gained 4 kilos since winter, new shoes, no duct tape. She came every weekend with Ruth. No one had asked her to, and no one could have stopped her. Among those in line that day was an elderly man there for the first time, stooped, eyes down, pushing his tray along like a man apologizing for existing. When his turn came, the girl behind the counter ladled his soup, set a second slice of bread on his tray, and said, "Kitchen's got extra bread today. Help me out so it doesn't go to waste." "What's your name, sir? So tomorrow, when you come back, I can call you by it." The bread was not extra, but some lies are passed down from mother to daughter, the way one passes down a key. People will go on telling the story of that morning at North Star Trust, of the number on the screen. But the people who were actually inside this story know that the number was never the miracle. $11 million could not buy back Unit 3B, could not buy back 9 days in a hospital, could not buy back a 37-year-old woman who knew everyone's name. There is an empty place that will walk beside Isla Fenwick for the rest of her life, and no bank statement will ever be able to print it. The miracle, if we must use that word, had happened much earlier and much more cheaply. A bowl of soup set down in front of a lonely old man, with a kind lie attached. A security guard who went down on one knee instead of opening the door. A slice of bread that was extra. Late in the afternoon, when the kitchen emptied out, Isla went to sit on the back steps of the church, where the ground sloped gently down toward the river. Far off, a freight train was running along the Mississippi, the steady grind of steel wheels on rail drifting up the hill. The girl took from her pocket the wooden whistle shaped like a locomotive, its surface polished to a shine by all the nights it had spent in the palm of her hand. She raised it to her lips and blew, the first time she had ever blown it out in the open since the day Mr. Pierce gave it to her. Long. Long. Short. Long. The signal a train sounds before a crossing. The signal of someone lost who wants to be found. The little wooden whistle came out low and small, dissolving quickly into the summer evening. Certainly no one on that distant train could hear it, but that had never been the point of the whistle. Mr. Pierce had already taught her, if you're ever lost, don't go quiet. Keep making a sound, and someone will find you.